Now we would like to commence JICA Ogata Research Institute Knowledge Forum Special Edition, Professor Joseph Stiglitz Lecture, The Global Economy in Multiple Crises, Challenges for Emerging and Developing Countries and Pathways to Enhance Resilience. I am Sasabe of JICA and today's MC. Thank you for joining us today. First, we'll ask Akihiko Tanaka, President of JICA, to give us opening remarks. Mr. Tanaka, floor is yours. Thank you for coming to JICA Ogata Research Institute Knowledge Forum Special Edition, Professor Joseph Stiglitz Lecture, The Global Economy in Multiple Crises, Challenges for Emerging and Developing Countries and Pathways to Enhance Resilience. Complex crisis of new coronavirus, Russian invasion of Ukraine, and climate change have been adversely affecting global societies, politics, and economics, increasing uncertainty. Specifically, emerging and developing nations are still in need of COVID measures, while their economies are challenged by energy and food price increase and risk of capital outflow triggered by U.S. monetary policies. Rapidly ballooning public debt is another concern. For example, this year, Sri Lanka default brought social instability and politics in crisis, as you are full aware of. Other nations are also concerned about the default fraught with geopolitical risks. We also shouldn't forget new changes have spawned already before pandemic, including nationalism, anti-globalization, and expanding supremacy of emerging nations. As for employment, some observers say manufacturing, which once led Asian growth, no longer contributes to creating new jobs in growth. They also point out issues such as bipolarized global labor markets and widening income disparity. That's why today we invite Professor Joseph Stiglitz of Columbia University to talk how so chaotic global economies should get recovered to establish resilient frameworks in society with a specific focus on emerging and developing countries. As you're very well known, Professor Stiglitz won Nobel Economics Prize in 2001 for his information asymmetry theory. His expertise resides around public economics and information economy. He served as a chief economic advisor and chief economist to U.S. presidents and published many beneficial studies on global economy. He also leads IPD, Initiative for Policy Dialogue, at Columbia University, where he actively works on a policy analysis and proposal for development of developing nations. JICA Ogata Research Institute and IPD have conducted joint research project on industrial policy and African development since 2008 and are currently working on the 5th round on global employment issues. During the side event of TICAD 8, held in Tunisia, August this year, jointly hosted by the AUDA and EPAD, Professor Stiglitz and JICA confirmed that economic structural transformation is needed and necessary to execute sustainable economic growth in Africa. creating a resilient society around the world against a crisis, protecting human lives, help us protect livelihood and dignity is human security. Under this human security mission, JICA partners with stakeholders in and outside of Japan to work on boosting resilience of world economy and society. Today's forum is a part of it, and hope we have deeper discussion together with Professor Stiglitz. After Professor Stiglitz's lecture, we'll ask Professor Yasuyuki Sawada of Tokyo University, a leading expert in development economy. We also invite Nobuko Kayashima, Senior Research Advisor of JICA Ogata Research Institute, to give us comments from the aspect of international cooperation in education and research. Moderator will be Akihiko Takahara, Executive Director of JICA Ogata Research Institute. I am very much looking forward to having a vigorous discussion today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, President Tanaka. Professor Stiglitz will now give a lecture on global economy and multiple crisis, challenges for emerging and developing countries, and pathways to enhance resilience. Professor Stiglitz, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be back at JICA after so many years in which we've all been isolated, and this is the first time I've been able to be back in Japan since the pandemic, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And to again thank JICA for the very fruitful collaboration that we've had for 14 years now, since 2008. And I'm also very pleased about the naming of the Research Institute after Madame Ogata, who was a very good friend of mine. And we worked together when I was at the World Bank and after I left the World Bank. So it's a very fitting tribute to her commitment to human security, which was the focus of so much of her own work. There has obviously been an awful lot that has gone on in the world. There are multiple crises. The pandemic, which is of uncertain duration, it's still having very big effects on global supply chains. And that's especially true with China's lockdown policies and its refusal to use more effective mRNA vaccines. But then on top of what was already a very difficult situation, on top of this very difficult situation has come the Russian invasion, aggression against Ukraine. Again, something of uncertain duration, but huge impacts on energy and food prices, and reminding all of us of how important the issue of resilience is, because the global economy has shown itself not to be as resilient as we had hoped. And hopefully I'll come back to that later on. One aspect of the lack of resilience is the fact that we're now facing a new set of crises, that of inflation, and unfortunately also a crisis of an impending global downturn. Unnecessary, but it's because of flawed policy. When I say flawed policy, it's the central banks, led by the Federal Reserve Board, raising interest rates. It should be obvious that inflation is not caused by excessive aggregate demand. There are supply shocks, food, energy, even cars. We know how to make cars. The problem in cars was a shortage of chips. In the United States, we even had a shortage of baby formula. I could talk about the reason for it, but the underlying point I want to emphasize is the market has shown itself less resilient than anyone had thought. It's a massive market failure, and we ought to understand the sources. Among the sources is that markets were too short-sighted. They did not take into account risk analysis in the way they should. They didn't price risk. And it's the same thing that happened in the 2008 crisis. Some of the inflation reflects the exercise of and the consequences of increased market concentration. The baby formula crisis was caused by one company having half the production of baby formula. And when it turned out it was not safe, not healthy, they shut it down. It caused a shortage with dramatic effects. In addition to that, supply shortages and the pandemic have led to demand shifts, leading to sectoral excess demand. But this should not be confused with excess aggregate demand. And monetary authorities operate on aggregate demand, not sectoral demand. And so the point is that increasing interest rates will not have much effect on inflation. It won't increase the supply of food. It won't increase the supply of energy or chips. And it may make matters worse because it makes it more costly to make the investments that are necessary to resolve the supply chain problems. There's some additional arguments using the Phelps-Winter model. Firms with market power will focus more on benefits of raising prices today, leading to even more inflation. And in one of the sectors that is central to inflation in the United States, the housing sector, there's evidence that higher interest rates get passed on to renters and exacerbating inflation. So there's only one central bank that's doing the right thing in the world today among the major, and that's Japan. And I've been trying to get both the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank to do that, but they haven't understood what I've just told you, which I think should be obvious. While we face the pandemic, Russian invasion, and now the crisis from increasing interest rates, the longer run crises have not gone away, and in some cases have gotten worse. The most important of these is the climate crisis, which interestingly has actually contributed to higher food prices. Because in many places in the world, there are weather events that are interfering with the supply. My own feeling is that we should use the war's energy crisis to reinforce the commitment to the green transition. And as I put at the bottom of the slide, somewhat jokingly, as variable as the weather is, even worse is dependence on fossil fuels, which is disproportionately controlled by despotic authoritarian people. I'd rather be dependent on the weather than on Putin. So I think it is important that we make the green transition. And I think that we are lucky because the cost of renewable energy have plummeted. And I think faster green transition will support enhanced growth and resilience. So the climate crisis is one of the crises that is continuing. The other one is the inequality crisis. The pandemic both exposed and exacerbated these inequalities. And the countries like the United States with the greatest inequalities are suffering the most, with more than 1 million Americans that have died from the pandemic. The reason should be obvious. COVID-19 is not what I call an equal opportunity virus. It goes after people who are in bad health. And when you have a lot of inequality and you don't have good systems of social protection and you don't have good public health care systems, then those people in poor health get much more seriously affected. But there's another aspect that I'll only be able to touch on, but I think is really important. Inequality weakens trust, and trust feeds anti-vaccination movements, anti-masking movements, and actually anti-democratic movements. So in my mind, the inequality crisis has contributed to what I see as a crisis in democracy. The fraction of the population around the world living in authoritarian regimes has increased. We thought at the end of when the Iron Curtain came down, Francis Fukuyama wrote a very influential book called where he talked about the end of history, that we were all going to be liberal democracies and free market economies. It hasn't happened, and now it seems so Pollyannish, so wishful thinking, and things have gone just the opposite way. So a real concern is extreme right parties are garnering substantial share of the votes even in normally functioning democracies. Part of the reason is that the view that current system is rigged to serve the interest of the establishment. And there's often a curious alliance between the populace and the wealthy with a policy agenda that actually exacerbates the inequalities. The consequence of all this is that trust in, you might say, the economic, political, and social system has been eroding, and that includes trust in experts and trust in science. And obviously, if there's erosion of trust in science, you get rise to anti-vax movements. And that then becomes a fertile field for mis and disinformation. And it makes rational decision making, rational policy making very difficult. And then the pandemic has had some very serious follow-on effects on the economy, and especially in developing countries and emerging markets. Interestingly, at the beginning of the pandemic, I don't know how many remember, it seems like ancient history now, but knowing that the pandemic would affect people in poor health more, many of us were worried that Africa would be devastated, Latin America would be devastated. They've not been hurt as badly as we worried about, but Latin America was very, very badly hit, but Africa not. And it's not actually fully understood. It may be partly data problems. It may be partly they had more immunity, but many of them were very adversely affected economically. And the reason for that is very simple. Countries like Japan and the United States spend 25, 29% of GDP to resuscitate their economy, to keep it going. The average developing country couldn't afford that. And they spent about 2% of GDP. And so in some of these countries, like Argentina, the decline in GDP was 10%. Some of them even greater. And many reasons for this. Of course, their export markets got weaker, but one of the consequences that it increased the debt problems in many countries, and I'll come back to that a little later. All of this has now exacerbated the development challenge, but I want to emphasize that that was even before these crises, developing countries in Africa and the other countries that were the low-income countries faced multiple challenges. It was one of the things that our joint project between IPD and JICA was most focused on. The most important is the model that works so well in East Asia wasn't going to work that well for Africa and the other countries for a simple reason. East Asia's model was based on manufacturing export-led growth, and the share of global output that was manufacturing was declining, 8%, 9% in the United States. Manufacturing has been the victim of its own success because of increases in productivity. Labor input is declining. Because labor input is declining, the advantages of cheap labor are declining. And so the comparative advantage that poor countries had of cheap labor was becoming less and less important. So two reasons: there was less potential employment in manufacturing, and the comparative advantage of developing countries was being eroded by what was going on. And combining that was the fact that climate change was affecting many of the developing countries much more. They depend on agriculture. Climate change affects agriculture more than any other sector. And the developing countries are disproportionately in the tropics, and the tropics are affected more than any other location. So all of this is bad enough, but then there's one more problem, which is the looming debt crisis. Some countries, like Argentina, had too much debt before the crisis, but many had taken on more debt than they should have before the pandemic. But then they had to take on more debt in the pandemic because revenues were down, incomes were down, and expenditures for health and for keeping the economy were up. And that means that the debt to GDP ratio of these countries has gone up. When interest rates are zero, managing that debt is not that hard. But remember, even when the developed countries, US, Japan, pay zero interest rates, Africa does not pay zero interest rates. They pay much higher interest rates. But when interest rates in the US go up, interest rates in Africa go up even more, and capital leaves these countries, and their exchange rate goes down. And because much of their debt is dollar denominated, they have to pay more in terms of their domestic currency to finance that debt, and the interest rate is higher. And meanwhile, they're also facing higher food and energy prices. So all over the world, World Bank, UNCTAD, IMF are all getting very worried about a looming debt crisis. A few countries have gone over, but there's just a nervousness that we face something that would be analogous to what happened when Boca raised the interest rates at the end of the 70s, beginning of 80s. We had the Latin American debt crisis, but now it could be all over the world. And it will obviously have a very big effect on the afflicted countries, but there are enough of them that it could have a global impact on global economic growth. Well, there's one other very big thing that's happened. It actually, you might say, began in 2017 with Donald Trump, with the new Cold War, but it has continued. President Biden, partly because of the new authoritarianism in China, the violation of human rights, the suppression of democracy in Hong Kong. And I think everywhere one can see this kind of polarization of the world. And then Russian invasion of Ukraine, the first land war in Europe. We thought that was, the UN was created to make sure that never happened again. And now it's happening. We couldn't believe it. And then President Xi supports Russia. The developing countries are going to face a challenge how to position themselves in this new Cold War. And they obviously, many of them would like not to have to choose sides, but it may be impossible. They may have to either say borrow from China or borrow from the World Bank and the West. So it's going to be a very difficult issue that developing countries are going to be having to navigate. Even developed countries like Europe are going to have to navigate them. But if you see this as a new global Cold War, there is a very big issue of how do you win a Cold War? And Cold Wars are not about munitions, they are about hearts and minds. How do you win the hearts and minds of those in the third world? And I think we in the democracies have not been doing what we should. And in particular, Europe and America begin at a disadvantage because of the history of colonialism, neo-colonialism, unfair trade agreements. The multilateral institutions, which are controlled by advanced countries, are often seen as unfair. The structural adjustment programs, one of the things that we talked about in our task force, the IMF structural adjustment programs led to deindustrialization of Africa and made Africa's development more difficult. So there's a lot of history, but what has happened recently has made things worse. Two things. One, the developed countries are responsible for climate. And even though today developing countries have more emissions than developed, historically the developed countries contributed the most. And they promised $100 billion to help the developing countries adapt, and they haven't delivered. So the promise was not enough, but they haven't delivered on what was promised. So the climate has made it worse, but even making it even worse than that is what has happened because of the vaccines, what I call vaccine apartheid. We've just been through the pandemic. Some countries ordered their vaccines. Canada ordered 8 times their population of vaccines. The United States and Europe ordered. But even worse than that was the refusal to allow those in the developing world to use the intellectual property when there was this shortage. Pfizer, Moderna, and there were pleas from South Africa and India early on in the pandemic. Let us use your, we know how to produce it. Let us use your intellectual property. Give us a waiver. And some of us, I was part of a campaign. We persuaded President Biden to support that waiver, but Germany, Switzerland, and UK refused. And so there was not that. And in spite of the fact that the existing legal framework called for compulsory licenses, but the process of compulsory license has very high transaction costs. It takes a long time. And there was an emergency. There was an urgency here. You didn't want to wait 3 years to get the compulsory license. And that was why we were saying you need a waiver, and Germany said no. And so there's a lot of bitterness. And that led to a couple of effects. One of them is it led to the disease to fester, making possible future mutations. It was even in the self-interest of the advanced countries to make sure everyone got vaccinated. But the Western drug companies put profits over lives and health. Western governments put the interest of their drug companies over the lives, but even over the foreign policy concerns. So, of course, this exacerbated developing countries had in keeping their economies going, but it has contributed to a very big foreign policy problem right now. One of the things that has been shocking to me is after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I expected everybody to support Ukraine. But Russian propaganda has been very successful in the developing countries. And why? One of the reasons is Russia and China were giving vaccines and even helping countries learn how to produce the vaccines when we weren't. And so that's why I call this how to lose a Cold War. We were doing everything we could to alienate the third world rather than to help. And this is where aid could help, but we haven't been giving enough aid to make up for these deficiencies that we have. And that's where JICA plays a very important role, but it's very important to make sure the aid is designed in the right way. What I want to emphasize is that in spite of the new Cold War, there is really a need for global cooperation. And that is going to be a very important different between the old Cold War and the new Cold War. Back in the old Cold War, we could live in two separate worlds. We didn't deal with China or Russia. We have to deal with them today because we have planetary problems of health and, most importantly, climate change. We share a planet. And there's another question. As we compete, can we simultaneously take advantage or comparative advantage, achieving at least some of the advantages of global trade? So it's inevitable there will be some delinking, but how costly will it be and how fast will it occur? And one has to remember, once started, matters may not be fully in our control. And we have to think about this. And this is really important when we think about the issue of resilience that was part of the title, and I'll come back to that later. So one aspect, though, of this that has not gotten, I think, as much attention as it should is as we move to renewable energy, if you look at what the inputs to renewable energy into solar and wind, all of them depend on critical minerals and materials, where 80% of the production occurs today in China. So as we become gone into the green transition, we've actually become more dependent on China. So the dependence on China is much more than the dependence of the world on Russian oil. That was only 10%. This is 80% dependence on the ingredients from China. And to me, it's very strange that we are threatening a very strong Cold War at the same time that we're getting more and more dependent on China, and we don't have a resilient strategy to deal with this issue. Well, it's obvious that Europe has been learning at great cost the risk of dependency on an unreliable trade partner. I hate to say, I told you so, but I'm going to say it anyway. I wrote about this in one of my earlier books called Making Globalization Work. What I said was that Russia was not a reliable trade partner, and for Europe to become so dependent on Russian gas is different from oil because gas goes through a pipeline. Oil you can get from any country in the world, but in a pipeline, you can only get it from the other end of the pipeline. And so the dependency was much greater and resilience was much lower. And it was just foolish. But there was some corruption on the part of the German government. And there was some, obviously, I think a full failed theory. The theory was that Russia would be dependent on Germany and therefore behave well. Well, I was skeptical of that. And now we see that that was correct to be skeptical. And if you have authoritarian governments, they do crazy things. And we can't explain what Putin is doing in terms of logic. It's just what happens when you have the concentration of power like that. The answer why they did it was also that they focused on the short term. They were saving a little bit of money in the short run by getting Russian gas, but the cost in the long run is enormous. So the dependence on Russian gas is a failure both at the level of the firm, at the national level, and this lack of resilience is a problem around the world. Excessive concentration of production makes economies more vulnerable. That was the example I gave earlier. And much of this reflects a neoliberal doctrine that was prevalent. Global trade was going to solve everything. And we were moving, it was believed, to a borderless world where borders wouldn't matter. And that was the main agenda since World War II. But it was a curious agenda because the basic unit, political unit, was the nation state. And we know that we didn't have democracies everywhere. And even where we have democracies like the United States, you have people like Donald Trump. And you can't rely on, that's unfortunately, even democracies lead to borders mattering. So the idea that you could rely on a borderless world was clearly shown to be flawed. Well, that brings us to the question of how do we build a more resilient economy? At the beginning of that, I think you have to break away from neoliberalism. That was a set of ideas that said that markets work perfectly. We should have known that's not true because in 2008, we had a global financial crisis. And the borderless world resulted in a mismanagement in the financial system in the United States becoming a global crisis. So we saw then that not only do good things go across borders, but so do bad things go across borders. So you didn't want to have necessarily to leave yourself so exposed. But we saw that the neoliberal agenda of deregulation didn't always work. Neoliberalism was based on idea that markets work perfectly, and my own work and a lot of other people's work had explained for 40 years, 50, why markets often don't work. And to me, the curious thing was that just when we as economic theorists were explaining the limits of markets and why we ought to be very careful, why there was a need for a role for government, why you needed things like industrial policies, why you, just at the time when we were explaining the failures of markets, Ronald Reagan and Maggie Thatcher were advocating free markets. And it's been a disaster that we're now going through. We saw the instability of the 2008 financial crisis. In the US, we've had the opioid crisis, the diabetes crisis, the environmental crisis, and we've seen the exploitation of market power giving rise to the inequality crisis. So a balanced view says you need collective action, and especially in a complex urban, innovative urban society, you need regulation, you need public investment, including for research, infrastructure, you need social insurance to mitigate and manage risk. And in my book, Progressive Capitalism, I talk about the need for a rich ecology of institutions. So I've been told I have only 5 more minutes, so I'm going to go a little bit faster, but I hope relying on markets is especially problematic in wartime. And Europe is at war. It's at war with Russian aggression, and it's pretending that it's not. And when you go to war, you have shortages. And if you let prices go sky high, you're going to have people suffer. There's going to be huge redistribution effects. You're going to get anti-war sentiment. You're not going to get solidarity that you need in wartime. And that's exactly what's happening in Europe. Energy prices, electricity prices have increased tenfold. It's a failure of the electricity market, the regulatory system that Europe adopted. It was a neoliberal agenda. We tried it in the United States, in California. It was failed miserably, created shortages. We got rid of deregulation. We went back and regulated, and the shortages disappeared. And Europe didn't learn that lesson. So the limits of markets are especially true in war, but they are also apparent in the process of structural transformation. When you have to make, markets are very good when you have to adjust from year to year a little bit. When you want to buy, people want to buy a little bit more of this or a little bit more of that, marginal analysis, and that's very good for where markets work well, really well in marginal. But when you have to make big changes, like the green transition, like a transition from peacetime to war or war to peacetime, markets do not work very well. And we're going through a lot of transitions. We're going through from manufacturing to service, to a green economy, to a knowledge economy. And we have to change our dependencies, a whole variety of dependencies, making our economy more resilient. So all of this says that we need a stronger role for government. So what I've already emphasized, markets on their own are not sufficiently resilient. It's partly that they have a tendency to be excessively short-sighted, not think about risks. The metaphor that I make is, I don't know if this has happened in Japan, but in the United States and in Europe, we build cars without spare tires. And the point was you could save money because you don't use a spare tire very often. But when you have a flat tire, and you're 200 miles, may not happen here, but when you're 200 or 300 miles from a gas station and you have a flat tire, it's miserable. The cost is very high, and the cost of having a spare tire becomes very small relative to that. And we made an economy with no spare tires. And an example is Europe's dependence on Russian gas, the US banks' excessive risk-taking, and also just-in-time production, which was very good for normal times, exposed thing. It was very good, but was very bad for a crisis like the pandemic. So what is needed is a reinvigorated industrial policy, focusing, of course, on today's problems, including the green transition. What is very interesting is the fact that the US, which opposed industrial policy for 40 years, argued all over the world, including the WTO, that nobody should have industrial policies, tried to stop the World Bank, have the World Bank oppose industrial policies, made statements like it doesn't make any difference whether you produce computer chips or potato chips. Now they are supporting industrial policies, and we just passed what we call our CHIPS Act. But those new policies are not consistent with the international rules that we created to stop countries from having industrial policy. So we have a global problem. We have to redo multilateralism. So some of these lessons are lessons that are true for both developed and developing countries, but are perhaps even more important for developing countries because the larger fractions of the population of firms that are vulnerable, a bigger source of structural transformation. And one aspect of resilience is the resilience to excessive debt. And that resilience includes diversification, both in sources of supply and sources of demand, and not having excessively concentrated production structure. One of the things is assessing resilience. They have to look at it from a systemic point of view, just like we do in finance. We see this is a resilience, diversification, not relying on one kind of microphone. An example of the right way of doing things. Let me just conclude. The world and perspectives on the global economy and policy have changed dramatically in just a few years. It's really quite dramatic, the most dramatic change I've seen in my lifetime. There's a great uncertainty about how things will evolve, highlighting even more the importance of resilience. The good news is that we have intellectual frameworks and tools to do a much better job of managing our way through this uncertainty. Rethinking along these lines is in line with what we needed to address the other key problems, climate change and inequality. What is required is a move away, I believe, from neoliberalism to progressive capitalism. Your prime minister has talked about a new form of capitalism, and I've tried to, in my book, Progressive Capitalism, explain what I think is the right form of new capitalism. Employing some of the tools that Japan used in its remarkable post-war restructuring. One of the things I think Japan should do is learn from Japan and what you did in earlier periods, but adapting and extending them to the needs of the 21st century. Of course, the challenge today for aid agency is how to adapt and extend these ideas to the specific circumstances of the less developed countries and emerging markets. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Stiglitz. You have taken us through this long list of crises that we are facing at the moment. And I've learned a lot. I couldn't agree with you more when you said that now we need to win the hearts and minds of the developing countries, what I call the new third world, because they don't really want to take sides. And I hope the American leadership will understand this and try not to divide the world into two, the competition between autocracy and democracy. That's one part of it, but it's not everything that explains the world. And I found that the premises of neoliberalism and the belief in the market was not complete. From a political scientist point of view, they didn't really fully reflect human nature. That's a basic issue probably that they had. But it's not for me to make the comments. I am so delighted to invite two distinguished commentators that we have invited today. And the first is Professor Yasuyuki Sawada of the University of Tokyo, the former chief economist of the ADB. So now the floor is yours, Sawada.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Takahara Sensei. And good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, wherever you are. Thank you. Thank you very much for JICA Research Institute for having me today. So we just listened to really insightful lecture by Professor Stiglitz, very comprehensive, and discussions. I can see, different pieces of a current global issues nicely put into one piece together. And so this is a really amazing, stimulating lecture. So in order to recap a few points by myself, and I'd like to share with you, I have two slides. And the first slide, I listed the four main messages I received from Professor Stiglitz's lecture. First one is that we are facing compounded different type of disasters. This is not the first time for the global economy, global society facing this combined multiple disasters. But after many years, we are now facing these compounded disasters. And because of this nature, COVID-19 crisis and Russian invasion of Ukraine, as well as price hikes, many or U.S. And European central banks seems to be cornered to undertake, particular policy, monetary policy stance. That's why we are seeing this interest rate hike. But as Professor Stiglitz nicely put in his discussion, I think it's not necessarily a right policy. But anyway, compounded disasters, cornering policies and governments, then that turn into exacerbated inequality and erosion of trust, and leading to a democracy crisis. So I think this sort of a vicious cycle has been started after or onset of the COVID-19 crisis. Because of this interest hike and expanded inequality, and also for the many government to respond COVID-19 crisis, enormous fiscal measures undertook by the different countries. Although developing country, because fiscal space are rather limited, and inability of putting a sufficient response is one big challenge right now. But in any case, expanded fiscal action led to a looming debt issue. So now a debt sustainability issue, as Professor Stiglitz again mentioned, it's not a new issue, but sort of reinforced. And COVID crisis and response and component, that's a really fuel this debt sustainability issue, as well as other development challenges, including climate change and also technological kind of strategic issues, as Professor Stiglitz said. Many core new technologies now made in China. So I think these are the very, very difficult challenges we are encountering. So I think these chain reactions and the vicious cycles ultimately leading to a new Cold War. So I think clear message delivered by Professor Stiglitz, we need a concerted global action to tackle this new Cold War. So again, this is so much insightful lecture, and I learned a lot. And but having said this, next slide, I have a few comments or questions. First one is towards the end, Professor Stiglitz, you emphasize, reinvigorate industrial policy, not old form, but somewhat elaborated version of industrial policies necessary. And I totally agree. Now compounded disaster, rare event, and big shock. Market doesn't work. Market incompleteness is really obvious and straightforward. So market failure, government needs to put some action against this market failure and correcting the market failure. Having seen this, having this said, I think government failure, this is an old issue, but still government failure, there is potentially a very large risk. So there are multiple kind of elements of my very bold question. What are the right industrial policies? Industrial policy, we knew, use battery, then industrial policy can lead to rent seeking and unfair competition, as well as overall inefficiency of resources. But on the other hand, if used wisely, especially performance-based and competition has been guaranteed, and also with clear targets and sunset clauses, industrial policy seems to work. So having this said, what's the example of how government and global society should design and implement new industrial policy? Relatedly, as Professor Stiglitz said, trust has been eroding. So I think in order to correct both the market failure as well as the government failure, probably people's solidarity or communities, cooperation and the mutual trust, and enhancing this, solidarity and the social capital, in other words, would be quite important. So from different angle, but my question is, what are the right industrial policies? So that's the first question. And second question, third question, actually, Kayashima-san will discuss, issues related to Japan, JICA. So I will stop up to a second question. So second question is related to East Asian development model cannot be applied to Africa because of changing landscape of industry, digitalization, whole digitalization, digital transformation has been ongoing, fourth industrial revolution, arrival of new technology displace manual laborer. So these kind of issues now kind of a canonical East Asian prime warranties model cannot be used, and many African countries cannot join prime warranties. Although I see to my understanding, I think Bangladesh is a very nice case. The latest, participant of the flying white geese, labor-intensive upper industry emerged, absorbed a huge number of young and capable, high-quality laborers, especially women laborers, and that really canonical East Asian type of industrialization dramatically change social position of women and girls in Bangladesh. All the social indicator shows the really transformative change made by East Asian type canonical prime white geese model. Of course, labor, safety guard issues. There are lots of challenges in Bangladesh. So there are important caveats we have to consider. But so having seen this Bangladesh, and another part, I tended to agree what you said. Africa, we cannot really follow Bangladesh or Korea or Taiwan. So because of this digital transformation, and your lecture didn't really much touch upon much about digital transformation. So how you would consider digitalization? On one hand, digitalization, like today, 400 people join this event from all over the world, and this is amazing, digital transformation triggered by a COVID-19 outbreak partly, but. So definitely digital transformation, digitalization will generate a huge amount of benefit for our global society. But at the same time, those who cannot join this digital platform will lagging behind. So digital divide will be also, there is a risk, social divide and digital divide fuel whole vicious cycle of exacerbated inequality and democracy crisis. So second question is, what is your view? What do you expect for digital transformation, digitalization? So these are the two questions I'd like to ask you.
Thank you, Professor Sawada. Professor Stiglitz, can I ask for your response in a few minutes?
Sure. A few minutes is going to be difficult, but I'll be very, I'll try. They're good questions. All of them are very good questions. Let me talk first about the right industrial policy. And I agree with you that there are government failures. It's hard to design. But overall, most of the East Asian countries succeeded, including Japan. So it can be done. And I would go even further. The US actually has had a very successful industrial policy. Even as it was criticizing other countries, it had an industrial policy, but it was buried in the Defense Department. So it just didn't call it industrial policy, it called it defense policy. But it was industrial policy. What was the most important transformation? It was a digital transformation, the internet. Who financed that? The US government. What is the other important transformation? Like mRNA and DNA. Who financed that? The government. So we had an industrial policy. We just didn't, we called it the NIH, the National Institute of Health. Everybody is in favor of health. How can you be against it? And we had defense. So even though we didn't call it that, and it was enormously successful. When I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, we calculated the return on our investments publicly in the public social return in research. And they were orders of magnitude greater than the private sector. And so we actually succeeded. Now, even more recently, people have criticized some of our energy policies, some of our investments, but Tesla, which is the very successful electric car, got $500 million from the US government, and it would have been bankrupt. It would not have existed without the US government. We made one mistake. We gave it money in a form of a loan. We took the downside risk that it wouldn't repay us, but we didn't take the upside risk that it would succeed. And we should have gotten a warrant stock in Tesla, but we didn't do that. The US government would be very wealthy instead of Musk if we had gotten the appropriate equity share for our risk. So one of the lessons from this is that make sure that you get the upside potential as well as the downside potential. Another important aspect of Japan's success was the principle of skin in the game. It made the private sector put at risk. They didn't get free money. The people who got the money had to put their own money at risk. So it was a way of making sure that they had some expectations of getting a return. And another aspect of good industrial policy is focusing on market failure, and we have a lot better understanding of market failure. So like in climate, one of the things is there's underinvestment in solar. One of the reasons is that homeowners have to pay in the United States 20% interest rates. Well, the government can lend money for solar panels at 2% interest. You can make sure it can get the money back because you can get it out of your taxes. When you file it, you lend money and collect it back as part of taxes. So you do industrial policy as part of your general government finance, and you can be sure, and the government will make a profit if it lends at 1% over the T-bill rate. But that would encourage people to make investments in solar panels. So there are a host of things that you can do today. One aspect of the 21st century industrial policy is we have to have broader objectives. Green, inequality, structural transformation. When Japan was doing industrial policy, it was all about growth. And now today it has to be a broader set of concerns. The second issue is a particular one is the digital transformation. And I think here, I mean, it's a complex subject, but let me just say just a couple of remarks. One of the advantageous things about development today is you can leapfrog. And you've seen examples of leapfrogging in cell phones. Big advantage because doing wires, the old phones, was very difficult in Africa. It was very expensive, and people often stole the copper. And so it was very, very hard. But then you come along with the cell phone, and that's much easier to make secure, and it's spread like wildfire over Africa. And that's given them a kind of connectedness that developing countries never had before. And the access has been amazing. So one aspect of, and then they've used that in a few countries very well. For instance, in Kenya, in the finance, where they got around some of the old regulations that gave all the power to the banks. And the result of that is they made a more efficient financial system. So there are ways in which I think the digital transformation will make a big difference. But I think there's some people who've interpreted digitalization to be the panacea. And I don't think that's going to be the case. I think it can play an important role, but it's only one part of, it's not going to replace manufacturing export-led growth. That is a more complicated and a more complex story.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very good learning about industrial policy in the United States. Now let me move to invite Dr. Nobuko Kayashima of the JICA Ogata Sadako Research Institute for Peace and Development and former Senior Vice President of JICA.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It is my great pleasure and also the privilege to be given to speak after Professor Stiglitz and Professor Sawada. Thank you very much. Professor Stiglitz, your presentation was very thought-provoking, as it clearly showed that there are complex and sometimes unfair structures underlying the multiple crises that world is currently facing. I completely agree that developed and developing countries need to work together to solve these problems. I learned a lot. Thank you very much. JICA has implemented and will implement various initiatives to address crises such as COVID-19, climate change, the war in Ukraine. For example, for COVID-19, JICA has committed approximately 754 billion yen at the current rate, including emergency assistance loans and related programs. This enables the construction and expansion of hospitals that will benefit approximately 200 million people in 22 countries. For Ukraine, which is facing an economic crisis due to the military invasion, JICA signed yen loan agreements, which totaled 78 billion yen by June of this year to provide it with financial support. As a bilateral aid agency, JICA has a variety of cooperation modalities ranging from the dispatch of volunteers, provision of small-scale equipment, to the granting of the large-scale government loans, which allows us for implementation finely tailored to the local needs. However, after listening to Professor Stiglitz's lecture, I once again strongly recognized the importance of not only support for individual projects, but also international collaboration to improve global frameworks, such as international intellectual property mechanisms. At JICA, we would like to make further efforts to improve such global governance mechanisms together with the local, the civil society and developing countries. It is important for developing countries to be involved as rule setters rather than simply as rule followers in establishing and implementing fairer international frameworks rather than international frameworks. JICA's international cooperation focuses on human resource development in developing countries, in addition to financial support. So we would like to do our best to support the development of human resource development in developing countries to improve their capacity as rule setters. This is my first comment, and I have another question which I would like to ask to Professor Stiglitz. In your last slide, you said that Japan's post-war development. Yes, would you please go to the next slide? Yes. In your last slide, you said that Japan's post-war development experiences should be adapted and extended to the needs of the 21st century and used to support developing countries. It might be a kind of gentle comment with that diplomatic consideration, but I would like to rather understand this as your warm encouragement to Japan. In fact, JICA is making efforts to share both the positive and negative aspects of Japan's development experience with developing countries and to utilize them in its international cooperation programs. Here, I would like to touch briefly upon Japan's development experience in education sector. Japan's post-war economic growth has been supported by quality human resources. Compulsory education was extended from 6 to 9 years during the post-war turmoil. Lower secondary education became universal in the 1950s, and by the early 1970s, the enrollment rate for upper secondary education exceeded 90%. This expansion of primary and secondary education with good quality laid the foundation for economic growth by nurturing capable human resources necessary for economic development. At the same time, on-the-job training in the workplace was developed along with the lifelong employment system, creating a learning society in Japan. However, since 1990s, Japan has experienced a prolonged economic stagnation, necessitating a renewal of the corporate structure and the mobility of human resources. thus the providing opportunities for reskilling of human reskilling of the recurrent education has become a top priority of current education policies in Japan. While Japan's experience in formal education can serve as a positive reference case for developing countries, Japan's lifelong learning system itself must be adapted to the new needs of the 21st century. On the other hand, when we look at the developing countries, both formal schooling and on-the-job training in workplace have been severely damaged by COVID-19. While the pandemic has contributed greatly to the use of IT technology in education and the increased educational opportunity for developing countries, such as the spread of the micro-credentials, inequality has also increased due to the digital divide. Therefore, I'd like to ask Professor Stiglitz the following question. In order to encourage the creation of a learning society in developing countries, it is necessary to develop both quality school education and a lifelong learning system in developing countries. While development of the school education system is primarily the domain of the government, how should the lifelong learning system be created in developing countries? How should the task of learning, lifelong learning be shared by the government, businesses, the communities, and individuals? Many developing countries do not have sufficient financial resources, even for providing the equal school education to everybody. I'd like to hear Professor Stiglitz's opinion on how to encourage an environment for lifelong learning in developing countries and whether Japan's experience can be useful in this regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kayashima, Professor Stiglitz. If you could kindly respond in a couple of minutes.
Okay. First, I want to just emphasize how important what you said was about helping developing countries being rule setter rather than rule follower. And there's so many areas where the rules have not been set in ways that are conducive to development. And I mentioned in my talk, intellectual property is one example where, and it's not just in health, but it's also in agriculture. Another one is the global tax regime, what they call the inclusive framework that was just agreed at OECD, is a framework that is disadvantageous to the developing countries. So you revise the global rules of multinational taxation, but it was done by the rich countries for the rich countries, and mostly to help actually the corporations rather than the governments themselves. And the third example are the investor agreements that have been written that are very disadvantageous to developing countries. So I couldn't agree more on that. I also agree, as you know, I wrote a book with my colleague, Bruce Greenwald, called Creating a Learning Society. And the thesis of the book was that actually the source of why our standards of living are higher today than they were 225 years ago is because we created a learning society. And it's not just the formal education, it's the lifelong learning that you emphasized. And a lot of the success of Japan was not just industrial policy that we talked about before, but also education policy and inclusive education policy. And the question, a really good question, is how in the 21st century do we make that successful? In some ways, modern technology can help, I think. And there are two aspects that I think have been actually revolutionary in the last 10 years. the ability of people to access learning through the internet and the development of the MOOCs, the massive online courses, and then the refinement of these courses to take into account insights from behavioral economics and from behavioral sciences. So trying to interact AI with people as part of the learning process. There are a lot of interesting things going on. I know in Silicon Valley, my daughter is involved in one of these projects, startups, but these are really very exciting ways of enabling people to have lifelong learning in very, very complicated subjects like machine learning, but also in less complicated subjects. And one of the interesting aspects of that is that most of the students on MOOCs, in Coursera, which is one of the big Silicon Valley, are in developing countries. Even though they come out of California, most of the students taking the courses are in the developing world, because their thirst for knowledge is very great. They understand that's the way to get ahead, and they want to have access to the best learning that they can. And the internet has made that possible. So in some ways, I'm really, what was very hard when Japan was going through this has become easier today with some of the new technologies. And since there's a much more widespread understanding of the key role that knowledge plays in a knowledge economy, the thirst for this is much greater. Finally, let me say, obviously, everybody has to be involved. If you're going to have a learning society, every institution in society has to be involved. Resources are limited. Some of the countries that have been most successful have mandated that employers or encouraged employers to develop lifelong learning. A certain fraction of the, implicitly a tax that is used for training, and have engaged in other things, like as part of the education system. Germany and Austria were very famous for their vocational training. And I was just in Austria and discussing with the labor and employment minister, and the question of, have they been able to adapt that to the new jobs? They were very good in teaching welding and the jobs that you needed in the manufacturing. I was interested in, have they been successful in doing coding, the software, the other things? And he said it's worked very, very well. And so they've actually are just as successful as they were in the past, or even more so. So that gives me an element of hope that as we change the structure of our economy, we will be able to involve employers working with the government to try to structure lifelong learning processes in the new sectors that it will be developing.
Well, thank you so much. I'm afraid I have to extend our time a little bit, if it's agreeable to the panelists. Let's aim to cover 3 questions from the online audience in 10 minutes time. Is that all right with you, Professor Stiglitz? Okay, then let me go ahead with the first question. Now, regarding the debt crisis, apart from debt cancellation, what options could we work out? Options that would not cut spending and hurt the poor and vulnerable people. That's the first question. Shall we go one by one, or do you want the three to be?
I can try to, I mean, obviously debt cancellation, debt restructuring, debt reprofiling is part of it. One of the things that I've been enthusiastic about, and I know some people at the IMF are enthusiastic about, is debt for nature swaps. The development countries have been making a very big contribution to climate by maintaining their forests, but it's providing a global public good, and they're not being compensated for it. And it would be good if we both fair and provide good incentives. If you say, okay, we will cancel your debt, but in return, you have to commit yourself to certain environmental policies beyond what you had previously done. And in a way, it's a way of getting foreign exchange, because it's a way of selling carbon reductions in return for a reduction in their debt.
Thank you. Next question. Political economy seems to be central to the new challenges you introduced today. For you, should we teach political economy now? What kind of new skills are needed to cope with the multiple paradigm shift?
That's a great question, but a very difficult one. The origins of economics was political economy and philosophy. And one of the things I've argued in a couple of my recent books, including People, Power, and Profits and Rewriting the Rules of the American Economy, is that markets don't exist in a vacuum. They have to be structured by law, but structured by rules, regulations, and so. But those rules, regulations, laws are made as part of a political process. So the idea that old style economics was as if the rules came from God, just existed. But now we know that they are created in a political process, and we have to understand better that political process. Now, one aspect of that I've been very interested in, and I think is very important, is the two-way interaction. If you have a lot of inequality in society, economic inequality gives rise to political inequality, but then the rules get made in ways to preserve and maintain that economic inequality. And so you can wind up in societies with low levels of inequality like Norway or Finland, or high levels of inequality like the United States. And the question then, how do you move from what I view as a bad equilibrium to a good equilibrium? That's a really hard question I don't know the answer to, but I think the first step is to try to understand a little bit better the interactions between politics and economics. You in your remarks made a comment about how economists have taken too seriously the rational view of the individuals as rational. One of the bad things that economics did, it's done a lot of bad things, but one of the bad things that economics did was export to political science something called the rational actor model. You probably know about this. And it's done a lot of damage in political science like it did in economics. And one of the things is to try to understand better how political processes actually work. And there is a lot of work going on. One of the aspects of all of this that I find very fascinating is the role of information, misinformation, disinformation. And to me, because political action is affected by your beliefs are affected by information, and a society's information system is very important. And who controls that? So in some countries, there is more public space, like you have BBC in the UK, and you have a public accountability. We privatized most of that. So you have Fox News with Rupert Murdoch shaping a large fraction of American opinion and just lying. And so how we think about you want free speech, but the power to shape has been privatized in a way that I think is very bad for our politics.
Yes, I think it's a very critically important question. What's the position of journalism should be in between the market, the state, and society? We always have to question this, I think. The journalists must think themselves how to behave. And we also find ODA a very political process. So at the Ogata Research Institute of Peace and Development, we have started to put more emphasis on studies of political economy. Thank you. Final question. This person asks, I was also concerned about too much dependence on Russia for energy. Today, I heard the amazing fact that green transformation was also dependent on China. What do you suggest to avoid risks of dependence on China?
Well, I think the answer is actually not that complicated. We haven't been thinking about the issue, and it just happened, without anybody even recognizing, looking at the data and seeing where those minerals, critical minerals, came from. And a lot of this has to do with excessive focus on saving a few pennies. A penny here, a penny there, saving money. And it may be one of the reasons why it's produced in China is they have very low environmental standards. And many of these products are environmentally difficult. And so we let it say, okay, if they want to ruin their environment, that's their problem. But it's a global problem as well. So if we think about it from this issue of resilience and dependence, I think what we ought to say is it's foolish for us to be that dependent. And if it increases the cost of renewable energy by 5% or 10%, it's still worth it. It's better than being dependent on fossil fuels, more reliable, and it will cost us a little more, but in terms of the long run, we're better off. So I think, but the market won't do this on its own. I think we really have to have a planning framework, a regulatory framework that says we cannot be that dependent. A decentralized system doesn't solve that problem because each person just looks at the cheapest source. He doesn't look at the systemic dependency, which is that 80% number. When I'm a firm, I just care, where do I get it from? But systemically, we have to think about what would happen if there were interruption. And borders still matter. That's the point. And that's where we're going to have a larger role for government and industrial policy to help make sure we produce those minerals.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your answers. And I'm afraid time is up. Already 10 minutes have passed the original scheduled ending time. But I'm so grateful, first of all, to Professor Stiglitz for joining us today and for the long years of cooperation with JICA, which I hope will extend even longer years to come. And thank you so much for the two panelists, Professor Sawada, Dr. Kayashima. And finally, I would like to thank the online audience who has sent us so many questions, over 20 questions, I can't even count. And all the questions that, because of time shortage, that were not able to be taken up today, I would like to share them with Professor Stiglitz for his reference. So thank you. Finally, I would like to hand back the microphone to our MC for the closing announcement.
With this, I would like to close today's special edition of the Knowledge Forum of JICA Ogata Research Institute. Thank you very much again for your kind attendance.